All right. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is James Patrick Bonus, but you can call me Japs. Thank you very much for registering and participating in today's webinar and expressing your interest in learning more about asset liability management. Now, to manage your expectations and also provide you some, to manage your expectations, we have designed this program to balance between your existing knowledge and experience with regards to financial markets and banking and into cooperative financial cooperatives with additional and reinforcing discussions on the topic. And for today's webinar, the topic of asset liability management, no, if we put it in a scale between basic and expert level, no, the challenge level for this particular session is somewhere in between. So the asset liability management is admittedly, when I was first exposed to it, it's a bit technical and advanced. However, as you go along, as you appreciate the business of banking and financial cooperative operating model, some of those topics become a lot more simpler. And hence, we've designed this program to balance between having bringing up to speed your knowledge and using and leveraging your experience when it comes to financial cooperatives and banking with further discussions and drill downs on the concepts as well as application of those relevant topics. So Ms. Maris has already provided reminders about this webinar. Let me go through, breeze through again some of the reminders. Please make sure to keep your microphones on mute. Kindly use the chat box for any questions, comments, or concerns. We'll pick that up during the discussions or at some select periods of time. We can take the opportunity prior to the break, perhaps, or at the end of each section. We can discuss further any questions that you may have. Also, I ask in advance in the event that there are connection issues from my part. So if I get disconnected, we endeavor to reconnect as quickly as possible. We have also in place alternatives and backups in the event of a pervasive connection issue. And one thing that I found useful with this type of technical webinar topics is to leverage our imagination. So all throughout the session, we have designed the program to visualize as much as possible the concepts, no matter how technical and no matter how technical. So hopefully the session materials coupled with your imagination would help you further understand the topics that we are about to discuss. Quickly, acepoint.ph is simply a one-man company, so it's just me. So far, we've delivered more than 490 training hours. No, most of it through BAIPHIL. So I appreciate BAIPHIL's confidence and continuing patronage in terms of tapping me as one of the resource person in delivering these types of topics. We have served more than 3,100 working professionals. Hopefully, we add further, especially from the cooperative space. And we are fortunate to be able to help our colleagues in the cooperative space with regards to your learning and development needs. acepoint.ph has been established with the goal of helping working professionals become better at what they do by providing programs that are easy to understand and training and professional advice that are based on carefully prepared analysis. Okay, for today's webinar is the first of at least 3 programs that have been prepared by BAIPHIL for MASS CDC. So sorry na, medyo mahaba yung name. So ano na lang, acronyms na lang. And for today, no, we'll be focusing on asset liability management. Then a week after, on Friday, April 12th, we'll discuss credit risk management. And finally, on Thursday, April 18th, we'll have liquidity risk management. So the participants may be different, or you may probably be enrolled to the other programs. These topics are interconnected and there will be overlap. So some areas and topics will be re-delivered or rediscussed in subsequent sessions. However, the focus would be on the main objectives of the webinars for those days. Now, yung April 10, it's not yet official, so it could move. So, but hopefully, there would be some definitive guidelines, depending on the recommendations of our Muslim Council and leadership. Okay, let's begin. So this webinar is about asset liability management. So why the hell do we have Netflix on screen right now? You're familiar with Netflix. No, I'm assuming most of you have at least heard about Netflix. Okay, Netflix is an app, a service. It's actually a platform that provides, moviegoers and people who enjoy consuming video content. Netflix connect them with the content producers, the movie producers, TV and series production companies. Now, basically, Netflix provides a platform such that they provide those content producers with technology and channel as a way to reach out to their respective audiences. In exchange, Netflix will then pay those content providers for their movies and TV series. Now, the value add naman on the user side is that they get to have access to those content in exchange for a monthly fee. So Netflix stands in the middle. They provide the technological platform so that two parties who have related interests, but on their own, they may not have an efficient or effective way of reaching each other. Netflix provides that platform. Grab Food, which is part of the Grab services, provides, again, two parties. One side would be the restaurants and the food providers. The other side would be your consumers who would want to order food and have them delivered at home. So Grab Food again provides a platform so that these restaurants will receive orders, have them delivered to the consumer, and then the consumer pays Grab Food for the price of the meal plus a markup for the services and delivery rendered. And then Grab pays back a portion to the restaurant. So Grab, again, much like Netflix, stands in the middle to provide such a platform for two market segments or customer segments that would have not otherwise consummate the transaction without an efficient platform in between. Ang CAS functions similarly in that they provide a platform so that commuters will be able to access more options for transportation, of course, for a fee. So why are we highlighting Netflix, GrabFood, and Angkas, who are predominantly known to be tech companies? Now, tech companies have long been tech companies had long been viewed as disruptors, having coming into the market, providing such services using technology, disrupting the respective traditional markets. Now, their operating model, their business model is not really new. It's just they deliver the services and follow through with those business models in an innovative way. But what we find in common with these companies is that they all stand as a platform. They service two sides, different segments, but they stand in the middle and provide a platform to make those transactions in between those segments as efficient and as effective as possible. That's also the same for banks and financial services, who are likewise referred to as financial intermediate. They are in the middle. They provide platforms between funds savers and excess fund holders who are willing to put their savings at least at a certain level of risk in exchange for a commensurate return. On the other side, there are your fund users and those that don't have enough funds but have productive activities that may benefit from those excess funds. And banks, financial institutions, including cooperatives, they stand in the middle so that they can connect those two segments together. Now, the fund savers, they give their funds to the bank, then the bank lends them out, collects the cash, and pays back the fund providers. So basically, it's the banking business model has been there for quite some time. No, they stand as a platform. Initially, brick and mortar. They're not technically, not yet. They don't have the technology yet. But right now, with the advancement in banking technology as well as in financial technology, the business model stays the same, but the manner of delivery has already advanced. Now, despite having advanced ways of providing financial services, be it savings collection or savings and deposits generation or lending activities, asset liability management, the discipline, the processes, the controls, they roughly remain the same. We just need to adjust and adopt those ALM practices and control objectives to stay attuned to the modern times. So the objectives of today's webinar, we have split it into three. The first one is we will establish why asset liability matters. Throughout the webinar, the discussion will have banking context. However, these topics are likewise relevant even for non-bank institutions. So if you're a credit cooperative, ALM is still as much as relevant to you as with a cooperative bank. So even for insurance cooperatives, at some point, ALM is still a relevant discipline. And in my experience, having spent initially my time with SGV as an auditor and financial business advisor for financial institutions and corporates, and then on as a finance and treasury executive in different banking institutions, I've seen that ALM is not just relevant for banks and financial institutions, but even for non-bank, non-financial institution cooperatives, corporates rather, sorry. And that the discipline is largely the same it's the manner of application and execution that would vary. And it's important for us to establish why ALM matters in the banking and cooperative business context. Next, we will dive deeper into ALM in terms of how it actually works. Now, we will focus on the financial risks that ALM takes on behalf of the financial institution and how it intends to manage those risks. And the final objective would be on what ALM areas we need to put emphasis on or put focus on. The objective here is to highlight that while ALM is actually in existence for quite some time now for banking institutions and financial institutions, there are certain areas, especially with the emergence of stricter regulatory expectations and prudential regulations, as well as the developments in the economic environment and financial markets, will have more will highlight areas that will need to be emphasized on or put some focus on with regards to ALM. Okay. Now, before we proceed with the discussions of the first objective, why ALM matters, let's first revisit the objective or purpose of a financial cooperative. So again, my emphasis here is on the financial cooperative. However, much of the discipline, the concept, likewise apply to other types of cooperatives and businesses in general. So, a typical bank, okay, would serve as a platform in providing services both for funds provider and funds user. And a bank, as a business, leverages on those two segments, the customer segments that they cater to, as their sources and uses of funds. So we'll emphasize on that later, and we'll drill down as to why ALM matters more for a financial institution compared to a non-financial corporate one. It has something to do with the nature of business that are involved, but also the financial and business risks that they take on. Now, the difference between a universal commercial or thrift bank versus a cooperative bank is that, in a cooperative bank, the members of the cooperatives have a greater claim as a stakeholder. So in a non-cooperative bank, it's the profit objective is there, as with a cooperative bank. But because the shareholders of a cooperative bank are likewise the ones most of the time are also the customers. So they have a greater point of interest when it comes to the success of the cooperative banking institution. No, this cooperative members provide equity through member contributions. And aside from that, they likewise leverage on deposit and savings products and services. And also are the ones who avail of loans and credit products. So, yan yung additional dimension when it comes to cooperative banks and financial institutions. Now, based on the information available coming from the Cooperative Development Authority, now when you look at the population of cooperatives in the country, so a significant portion comes from credit and financial services, banking, and insurance cooperative cluster. So member-wise, they have one of the biggest, 9.7 million. As of 2022, December 2022. And in terms of total assets, they've contributed almost 550 billion pesos with net surplus of around 24 billion. So our topic for today is relevant for them, but for all other cooperatives as well, to a certain extent. No? Now, looking at the cooperative's purpose, no, there are a lot of objectives that a cooperative would want to achieve. However, we will emphasize on select line items. One would be to encourage thrift and savings mobilization among members. We're clear about that, especially for savings cooperative. We want to encourage members to be to balance consumption and savings, having to enjoy the fruits of their labor, but at the same time being prudent enough to save for a rainy day. Another objective is to generate funds so that members can use it or tap into it whenever they need credit. So rather than rely on informal loan sources, so they can tap into the credit cooperatives as a source of loans and funding, especially for their business needs. And cooperatives can be set up likewise to pool funds and use it as an insurance against losses among members. So there are insurance cooperatives that function like a life or non-life insurance company, subject to the rules and regulations of the Insurance Commission, but are likewise being pulled together for the benefit of their members, for likewise the stakeholders and shareholders. So yeah, I'm pretty sure you're already familiar with regards to the objectives of cooperatives. However, for our purpose, for ALM discussion, we emphasize these objectives as they are the most relevant when it comes to asset liability management. The most common types of cooperatives where ALM is most relevant would be credit cooperatives. So pools of funds have been collected as from member contributions, and we pull them together and lend them out to qualified consumer loans and select businesses as well. Next would be cooperative banks. No, it has the same business objective of lending pooled funds, but apart from member contributions, it also generates deposits and collects and holds savings and relends those funds to generate more value for the organization. And we have insurance cooperatives wherein they generate member contributions as capital for absorption of insurance risk and losses. Now, all these three financial cooperatives have or use asset liability management disciplines, principles, and controls to varying degrees. And we will highlight further how each of these three would be able to leverage on ALM processes and controls. Now, allow me to emphasize further banking cooperatives, because especially for coming from a BAIPHIL member, this is one of the businesses that I have most I can relate to the most. No? So allow me to emphasize on it further. Now, using the statistics collected by the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, or the BSP, on cooperative banks as of December 31, the total assets held by cooperative banks is around 28.53 billion. Now, if you look at its composition, more than half is coming from is deployed to loans and credit products, around 17.5 billion pesos. Around 1 billion is placed in investments, which are, I think, predominantly government securities and other types of investments. Now, total asset of 28.5 billion. No, it's the same number on the liabilities and equity side of the balance sheet, wherein 18.33 billion came from deposits. Now, these deposits could be from members of the cooperative as well, or it could have been collected from third-party individuals, non-member cooperative of the cooperatives. Now, equity is around 5.5 billion. It's a combination of member contributions, surplus that have been accumulated net of any distributions, and inclusive of cooperative required surpluses for education and all other mandated allocations for cooperatives. For the year 2023, total revenues contributed or generated by cooperative banks is around 2.72 billion, and 2.28 billion has been spent for expenses, losses, and charges. Now, roughly, the net profit before taxes and other accounting adjustments is around 442 million. Now, at least you have a picture of the industry, the cooperative bank's industry financial statistics. Now, drilling deeper into revenues, around 1.8 billion is generated from net interest income, meaning these are yields generated from lending activities predominantly, net of interest expenses paid for deposits and funding sources. The revenue also includes around 500 million pesos worth of fees and commissions. So all other financial services that are not necessarily lending, but have been rendered by the financial cooperatives of cooperative banks rather, have been generated from fees and commissions. Okay. We've highlighted the balance sheet and income statement of cooperative banks, at least the cooperative banking industry. And we cannot talk about asset liability management without highlighting balance sheet and income statement. So the balance sheet right now is already called statement of financial position or statement of condition. Income statement is now referred to as a statement of financial performance or of statement of operations. Now, we'll go through quickly accounting 101, especially for non-accounting and non-business professionals, participants that we have today. At least you will quickly be refreshed of your accounting basics. So what we've highlighted earlier is balance sheet and income statement. And all throughout the session, this being topic on ALM, Asset Liability Management, we'll have to refer to these accounts time and time again. Now, accounting 101, let's revisit. Okay, asset, liability, equity, revenues, and expenses. Keep it simple. What is equity? Equity, when you look at the definition of equity, equity is residual or remaining value of an owner's interest in a company. It's a bit technical, but to simplify, that's equity simply means a member's interest after all liabilities have been paid coming from those assets or from the business. This is basically a numerical representation or value as of the financial records of the cooperative as to the members' interest in the business. So if the business has been earning consistently all throughout the year, you would expect equity to grow over time. And that represents the owner's interest in the company. Emphasis on residual or remaining because we also have to factor in liability. No? For credit cooperatives that don't rely on savings for funds, no, the amount of money that they lend out are predominantly coming from member contributions. So in that case, majority of what is lent out and put at risk would be the equity of those member contributors or contribution rather. Now, if a cooperative is a bank, no, that generates funds through deposit taking and savings, then liabilities would be greater or higher, will have a greater composition of their balance sheet. Liabilities represent claims by creditors, lenders of the company or the institution, and other payees arising from the business past activities that resulted in obligations that are supposed to be settled at some point in the future, mainly through cash or other asset outflows. Now, again, to simplify, liabilities are the cooperative's financial obligations that are time-bound, that needs to be settled at some point in the future. So, if it's a credit cooperative and there are bills to be paid because of the use of rented property or electricity, the capturing of those obligations in the records generates a liability for that credit cooperative. If a cooperative bank receives deposit, whether it's from a member cooperative or from a third party, then that deposit is the liability of that cooperative bank. Here, the emphasis is it's a financial obligation of the cooperative and it must be paid back at some point in the future. The difference between a member's contribution and a member's deposit is that a contribution is not time bound, no? Unless there are membership rules in terms of how to govern those contributions. Generally speaking, a member's contribution for equity purposes, it does not have any obligation to be paid back. Unless the member withdraws, no, that's a different manner altogether. That's akin to a shareholder divesting from the business, but that's a different topic. A liability, on the other hand, is a cooperative's commitment that it will return that money plus a form of compensation. So yung deposits are liabilities. The difference between liability and equity is that a liability has a deadline, has a due date. An equity does not have. Cooperatives are not obligated to pay back those equity contributions. Now, assets represent resources controlled by the enterprise arising from its use of funds generated throughout the business. And the purpose of holding those assets is to generate value or follow through with the products and services committed by the cooperative or organization. So, to simple speak, assets are the business resources that are used to generate further value for its cooperative members and customers. So for a banking cooperative, an asset would be your loans and investments. For a non-financial institution business, let's say, for example, into merchandising, so assets would include inventory, the premises, the facilities used to deliver those services. Revenue represents income earned by the company as compensation of the business for delivering goods, rendering services, and other value-adding activities for its customers and counterparties. So, ito yung kinikita, the one that's being earned by the company in pursuit of its corporate goals and objectives. Expenses represents costs, charges, and losses incurred by the business in the delivery of products, services, and value add. Basically, the amount of money required to be spent or incurred by the business or cooperative in the pursuit of delivering its and following through with its corporate and cooperative objectives. So, as a credit cooperative, expenses includes bad debts because not everyone will be able to pay back the loans on time, in full, or at all. Now, we will emphasize that further in the credit risk management webinar, but that's also relevant when it comes to asset liability management. So, revenues and expenses. So, revenues are the monies spent and paid to us by the customers because of the value that we deliver to them. Expenses are the costs and charges that we spend as part of delivering that value. So, profit or loss? No, profit represents excess of revenue over expenses. We are at a net loss if our expenses are more than revenue. The important thing here is that that profit is closed against retained earnings or surplus. No. And a portion of that surplus is allocated as part of the mandated allocations under cooperative rules. Now, debits and credits are part of accounting. However, all throughout ALM, we will not be mentioning this. However, it's still important that we understand debits and credits. Now, debit and credit is just a way to describe the direction or flow of value within and outside the cooperative. Now, when we talk about normal balances, meaning when you look at a financial statement, you would expect assets to always be a debit balance, liability and equity to always be a credit balance. And the reason here is that they are always opposites because your assets came from either borrowings or contribution from members. And if you need to increase asset, you need to debit asset. And you need to increase liability and equity, you need to credit equity and liability. If you need to reverse or decrease, opposite naman. No? Credit asset, kaya debit liability or debit equity. Revenues and expenses, pabaliktad. Later, I will highlight why. Okay? But when you need to increase or recognize revenue, you need to credit revenue. And when you incur expenses, you need to debit expenses. Now, if you need to reverse revenue, debit revenue. If you need to reverse expense, you need to credit expense. However, that's a warning sign, no? That you don't usually encounter a debit to revenue or credit to expense. No, that one is a red flag. If you see one, that means it's unusual. Now, why do we need to understand debits and credits for accounting purposes? There is a saying, there's no such thing as a free lunch. So in accounting, no, those accounting entries, that's why there's always a debit, which should always have a credit partner. They are basically cause and effect. No, the debits and credits are always interrelated. And in business, there is no free lunch. So a transaction, an activity must have come from somewhere. So assets and expenses are always debit because when you buy an asset, you either credit cash, kasi naglabas ka ng cash, you gave out cash, and you receive another form of asset, or you paid someone their salary, that's an expense, you credit cash, which is an asset, cash was spent, so you decrease the balance of your cash. Or you could have incurred a liability in exchange for buying a vehicle for the cooperative or accruing rent expense. So asset and expenses are always debit because a transaction on the debit side usually either generates value for you as an asset. If that spend is not no longer generates value in the future, it becomes an expense. Liability and equity, these are your sources of funds. Credit, so if you receive member contribution, it's a credit to equity and debit to cash because your cash increased. Or if you receive deposit or through bank borrowings, then the cash received is a liability. Same is true for assets. Let's say, for example, the contribution is in property. So debit asset, property, credit, member contribution, equity. Or if there is a merchandise inventory purchased on credit, so debit inventory, which is an asset, credit accounts payable, which is a liability, credit. Now, see, revenue is a representation of a return you generate from equity. However, that return is not entirely yours kasi you have to allocate money for expenses. But basically, revenue and equity are on the same side. They're both credit. So when you sell merchandise, you earn revenue, so credit revenue, you receive cash in exchange for that transaction. Or if there again other types of compensation in the form of asset, when you receive asset as revenue or equity, debit asset, credit revenue, or credit equity. So how does that look like in practice? Your balance sheet shows you all your assets on the left-hand side, all your equity and liability on the right-hand side. Your statement of performance or statement of operation or income statement shows all your revenues and all your expenses for a particular period. See, balance sheet is as of a point in time. See, income statement is for a period of time. Now, in the beginning, as with all businesses, you begin with your own or the owner's equity, owner's contribution. So the owners would contribute money, and that money will be used for operations. So you have debit asset, credit equity. That's your balance sheet. Now, as with any startups, you will incur pre-operating costs. So puro expenses mo na yan. Hiring of people, setting up of premises, purchase of merchandise. So that would reduce your assets, and expense is loss, translate to losses without revenue. That losses reduces equity. Now, once the business earns revenue, any net profit is added to equity. So your balance sheet grows. So because you have more cash that you receive from your original investment and for your additional revenues, so your balance sheet will grow. If you incur liability, your asset side will also grow. So your balance sheet again will in total will grow. If you operate further, your equity portion of the balance sheet will grow further, especially if your in a net surplus or net profit for a particular period. Now, if you're incurring or you're generating more revenue, you can further grow your balance sheet. So kanina, assets and equity lang siya. Now you have a combination of a bigger equity portion, a combination of member contributions and net surplus. And you're also generating, let's say, deposits for your cooperative bank. Then your balance sheet becomes larger. One tip I could advise is that when you look at a company and you want to learn from the balance sheet whether that company is growing, look at the liability and equity portion. Because if the company is growing mainly because it's borrowing money, then it's not a red flag, but it increases their financial risk. But if a company is growing because they're reinvesting the surplus funds to further grow as a source of funds, then that is sign of organic growth, which is a good thing. Now, if a business incurs expenses larger than the revenues, then they end up reducing their surplus because of a net loss. So that would put pressure in the balance sheet because liabilities now have higher liabilities in terms of proportion of equity is now higher. So the overall goal, especially for non-bank businesses and cooperatives, is to have a larger portion of equity versus your liabilities. If you're a cooperative bank, then it's natural that you have a higher liability base as a source of fund. But that's where ALM becomes a lot more critical. So looking again at this financial cooperative model, that's basically the balance sheet of the cooperative. The member contributions are equity. The deposits being received from members as well as from non-members are liabilities. Now, those funds generated from member contributions and deposits taken together and redeployed as a lending product, those are your loans, and a portion of it are investments. So, looking at this diagram, ALM is actually in between. So, the cooperative bank is already a platform for members and non-members to be able to efficiently generate savings and loans. ALM stands inside the company as an additional platform so that the lending and savings unit within a banking cooperative would be able to perform their functions a lot more effectively and efficiently. Okay, any questions po so far? We have just set the table for ALM. Okay, let's formally proceed with the first objective. Why ALM matters. Okay. A CEO of a bank or any financial institution that takes on savings, deposits, generates loans, and have lending activities, they are charged with a very large mandate of taking care of those funds while also generating profits for the business. And you wonder what would keep them awake at night. Now, what are the risks and issues that they think about? The first would be not enough funds. As a financial institution, a cooperative bank, or even a credit cooperative, you would wonder, especially with the targets that you have, the revenue and profit targets that you have, where would I get the money? Sure, you can always say, generate more deposits or ask more contributions from the members. Easier said than done. But that question, not enough funds, always linger on a daily basis, especially for the large financial institutions. Where would we generate the funds? And if there are withdrawals or shortages in terms of generation of funds, how are we going to balance the difference? Another concern that bothers CEOs of lending and deposit institutions would be, what if the borrowers don't pay back? Now, this is especially relevant for credit institutions that rely on recycling of capital or funds coming from payments of borrowers. That is likewise a cause of concern. And also, what if our projection, our understanding or market outlook of what may happen in the financial markets turn out to be grossly inaccurate? Kasi you can never be accurate or perfect when estimating the future. You always play with probabilities. Now, what if you're way off the mark when it comes to forecasting what may happen in the future? Your investments may turn out to have lower values than you can that you have anticipated or have appetite for. So that would generate potential market losses. Now, all these three concerns they have their names. Not enough funds, that's liquidity risk. Borrowers don't pay, that's credit risk. And when your market outlook is wrong, that is market risk. As a financial institution, as a business in general, we are exposed to these types of financial risk in some shape or form. We have different degrees, varying depths, and different ways of approaching and managing these types of financial risks. And ALM is interested in how the institution as a whole manages these types of risks, because the way an institution responds to this risk impacts ALM in terms of their strategy, their processes, and their controls. Okay. Let's do a quick business 101 naman. Business 101. How does a business work? Okay. We start with owner contribution. So for a cooperative, you pull member contributions. In exchange, you get cash. Now you use that cash to start the business, to buy, let's say, a merchandise, boxes that you can then resell the boxes to your customers. In exchange, your customers pay you cash and you generate revenues. When you generate revenues, you generate surplus, then you accumulate those surplus. Those surplus becomes additional sources of funding. Those sources of funding, member contributions plus accumulated earnings or surplus, are what we refer to as equity. Again, a source of funding would be equity. That's the starting point. Now, we can already proceed with business as is by just, repeating the cycle all throughout, by accumulating or generating revenue from recycling the member contributions, generating revenue, deducting expenses, and then reinvesting the proceeds. What we can additionally do is also leverage or tap into third-party funds by borrowing. So we can borrow from a bank and add those funds as part of additional pool that we can then accelerate the business. And those funds are what we call liabilities. We have a question. We have someone who raised their hand.
Yes, Mr. Jobs.
Okay. Do we have a question?
Do you have a question? Yeah, kindly unmute your microphone, sir. From MASS PC Co-op, the one who's raising his hand. Sir, kindly unmute your microphone, please. Do you have a question?
Okay. We can proceed with any questions that you may have. We can take it up later on before we have a break. Okay. So what we've recently described is how a business actually works. They generate funds from member contributions, shareholders. You use those funds to start the business, then generate net revenue. Revenues less expenses. You generate profits. Rather than distribute those profits as dividends, you reinvest those profits as additional source of revenue, additional source of funding, which you can then increase your asset base, purchase more inventory, or lend to more borrowers, and then repeat the cycle. However, if we want to accelerate our ability to generate more profit for the business, we can tap into other people's money through deposits or borrowings. We incur liabilities. So what we're highlighting here is the sources of funds are mainly from equity, which is good original contributions or accumulated surplus, or liability. You borrow money from others. Now, why do we need to borrow money? Borrowing money is leverage. Leverage, the effect of leverage is to amplify the outcome of a deal or transaction. What do we mean by leverage and what do we mean by amplifying the outcome of a transaction? Let me illustrate. Again, suppose you're starting a business with, let's say, 1,000 pesos as your starting capital. That's your contribution to the business, so equity. Then you happen to meet a customer who's looking for boxes. What you can do is you can take on that challenge, that opportunity, and say, yes, I can supply one box for 1,100. So using your starting capital, you purchase a box worth 1,000 pesos, let's say from a warehouse, and you sell that box for 1,100 as agreed. So in this particular situation, you generated revenue of 1,100. The cost is the cost of the purchasing your box from your supplier or warehouse. You earn a net profit of 100 pesos. So comparing that to your original capital of 1,000, that's actually a 10% return on equity. Not bad. So if you just continue to do that, you'll continue to earn 1,000 pesos all throughout. 10% return on capital for every sale that you make. However, that means that if your funds are only 1,000 pesos, then you're limited to the capacity of that 1,000 pesos. If the market is asking for more and you cannot deliver, that means you have more demand than supply. So you're missing out on the opportunity to generate more revenue. That's where, borrowing comes in. That's where leverage comes in. You can borrow money to augment your equity. So from 1,000, you borrow 9,000 pesos. You promise to pay it back to the bank plus 1% interest. Your total cash is now 10,000 pesos. Initially, you can only buy 1 box. Now you can buy 10 boxes because you now have 10,000 pesos. So you can sell everything for 11,000 pesos. Instead of 1,100, you now have 11,000 as your total revenue. The cost is 10,000 pesos plus the interest that you have to pay back to the bank, 90 pesos. You now have 910 pesos as net profit in just one single transaction. That's a 91% return on your original investment. So leverage has the effect of amplifying the returns from 10% to 91%. That's 9.1 times after deducting the cost of the borrowing. That's the effect of leverage. In science, leverage amplifies the energy or effort that you originally employ to achieve an outcome. It's the same with financing. However, the risk here is that when you use leverage to amplify the effect of a transaction, it amplifies both the potential return as well as the potential losses and risks. Now, same transaction, if you borrowed funds and you bought the 10,000 boxes, and then all of a sudden your customer says, sorry, I'm already good. I will not buy them anymore. Now you'll end up not having any cash revenue. You'll be stuck with 10 boxes worth 10,000 pesos, which you cannot use to pay the bank. So you'll end up having to declare bankruptcy because you basically cannot pay back the bank loan. The bank can foreclose and take those 10 boxes, but it doesn't guarantee that they can turn it into 10,090 pesos overnight. So that's the effect of leverage. And ALM becomes a lot more critical because that leverage is present especially for cooperatives that take on liabilities and deposits. Now, another reason why ALM matters, especially for a financial cooperative, is simply because you take in funds from your members. And those funds we hold as a fiduciary duty to take good care of those funds and grow those funds in pursuit of the cooperative's objectives. Now, if you're the cooperative and you're given these funds by the members, what do? Is it better to simply keep those funds in cash? Now, that means any member who would want to withdraw or any expense that we need to pay, we can always pay on time. However, the problem of always keeping everything in cash is that cash on its own does not generate any revenue. Especially for a financial cooperative, a credit or bank cooperative, cash doesn't make you any money. You can put it in a time deposit, but time deposits can only yield you very little interest. Okay. What if we deploy 100% of those cash in loans? Okay. That will generate returns through interest. But the problem with deploying everything into loans is that when you need to pay for your utilities, for your rent, or salaries, or if the member withdraws, where will you get the money? Is there a market where you can sell your loans? I'm not familiar with, or I'm not, I don't know of any organized market for that. So that's a problem. Now, if I'm the cooperative, what if everything in government bonds issued by the Bureau of Treasury? 100%. So it earns interest, and it has an organized market wherein if I need to liquidate, I can sell a portion of those government securities and get cash in return. You can do that as well. The problem here is that you're not optimizing. You're not maximizing the potential revenue opportunities. Sure, you can build a cooperative and everything will just be invested in government securities. You are virtually guaranteed to receive the principal back and interest because default risk is at its minimum if it's deployed in government securities. So it's almost no default at all. But the problem there is if you are tempering your risk too much, then you're also tempering your opportunity to generate revenue. So as the saying goes, the higher the risk, the higher the return. The lower the risk, the lower the return. Now, ALM becomes a lot more relevant because a financial cooperative, a credit cooperative, or a bank cooperative, one of its goals is to pursue maximum generation of net profits and surplus. And for an institution to achieve that as optimally, as efficiently as possible, you need a mix of assets. You will need to set aside a portion for cash, deploy those funds in loans, but keep a portion in investments that you can then tap into and convert into cash in the future, while still earning you a decent amount of return. ALM matters because you have to strategize and determine the optimal mix of earning assets on a continuing basis, especially when you have funds from members coming in and out of regularly. Now, this image depicts a balance sheet where you have left-hand side assets, right-hand side liabilities and equity. But if you drill down further into those assets, liabilities, and equity, you would see that a financial cooperative's accounts are split into different maturities. Some assets, such as cash, you can always withdraw them anytime. But some loans have maturities more than 1 month, more than a year, at times more than 5 years. So you have a variety and a mix of loans and investments that have different maturities, different deadlines, different timing of cash flows coming back. And it's the same for institutions that take on deposits. Most of the deposits and savings are current in nature, so they can be withdrawn anytime, while some offer time deposits and longer-term borrowings that could mature at some point in the future. So this mix of varying amounts, varying frequency of withdrawals and deposits, varying disbursements of loans and investments, they put a lot more complication in terms of managing a financial cooperative's business. And that's where ALM comes in. ALM becomes a lot more important, especially if there are changes to the deposit behaviors. Let's say, for example, you anticipated that 70% may withdraw anytime. But in actuality, because of a change in the environment, a lot more people withdrew their funds than normal. Then that changes your cash flow schedule, that rearranges your priorities when you need to make certain adjustments. Also, if an investment turns out to not generate the required returns, meaning the original invested funds of, let's say, 1 million, because of market movements, that 1 million is now 800,000. So that 200,000 loss may become an actual 200,000 pesos worth of cash that's no longer coming back to the coffers of the cooperative. That again requires adjustment and calibration of ALM priorities and strategies. Speaking of losses, if a loan defaults or is at risk, a higher risk of default, that becomes again an important issue for ALM to calibrate their expectations and approaches. So all these, varying degrees of volume and maturity and commercial rates, ALM looks at it in totality. ALM is up top, viewing them from the beginning, from a cooperative point of view, and netting out any assets and liabilities that have similar risks and maturity dates, managing it on a net basis. Okay. So in summary, why ALM matters? ALM, or Asset Liability Management, is important because as financial cooperatives, be it a credit cooperative, a banking cooperative, or an insurance cooperative, you have sources of funds that are diverse or spread out. No, you take in member contributions as equity, keep the profits that you generate as additional source of fund through accumulated surpluses, and also tap into borrowings and deposits to augment those existing organic sources of funds. And those funds are deployed to different types of assets that generate different types of returns and risks to the cooperative. The goal is to maximize your opportunity to generate revenue. However, those revenue comes along with financial and business risks. Ideally, you would want to keep as much cash as you want. However, those cash, if left in the bank, does not generate any returns that would cover for the operations of the business. You can deploy them to loans, but then you need to set aside a portion of your funds to fund your operations, your day-to-day operations, as well as deploy in certain safe investments so that you will still generate returns or income from set aside funds and still convert them into cash when you need to. And finally, ALM is charged with managing the balances of the entire financial cooperative through managing the impact of varying volumes of deposits and loans, different commercial rates, different maturity dates. They have to contend with changes in the market that could result to losses and be apprised with defaults, which could impact future cash inflows. Any questions that you have on why ALM matters? Any questions, Bob, at this point? Okay, time now is 10:25. Let's have a 10-minute break. Let's resume 10:35. Ms. Maris?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Jobs. So I'll be sharing on the screen the timer for our 10-minute break. Likewise, you will see BAIPHIL's upcoming webinars, which might be of relevance or interest to you. Let's enjoy the break and see you after 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, and we're back. I hope everyone had their 10-minute break. So let me check if the participants are here. Can I see a thumbs up? Thumbs up. All right. We have 5. How about the others? Guys, if you have any questions for our SME, please do not hesitate to ask. You may use the raise hand button or you may type your questions in the chat box. All right. So let's welcome back. Hello, Miss Rosario Lim. Do you have any question? All right. Okay, let's welcome back Mr. Jobs. Mr. Jobs?
Thank you, Ms. Maris. Thank you, everyone, again for returning. Okay. So prior to the break, we summarized why ALM is important, or why ALM matters when it comes to managing financial institutions, be it a credit cooperative, a bank cooperative, and even for insurance cooperatives. Now, we will proceed with how ALM actually works in the context. Now, we're coming here from a context of banking, but again, we can imagine or replace certain aspects with other aspects applicable to your financial cooperatives. Now, one of all businesses would have this as a main objective. The goal is to generate as much profit as reasonably possible. I emphasize the word reasonably, because we all have limitations in terms of the resources, the time, the amount of risk that we can take for a given situation or purpose. However, we still have to focus in terms of the details of how we intend to achieve this profit objective. And businesses would always have an intention of maximizing revenue sources and potential, while also minimizing any the costs, expenses, and risk attributed to generating that revenue. So it's always connected. When you try to generate revenue, you also have to incur resources and costs, expenses, and risk. And the goal there is to generate as much returns and revenues by incurring as little expense and absorbing as little risk as may be possible. Now, when it comes to financial institutions, those revenues take the form of asset returns and earnings coming from loans and investments. Those expenses predominantly include interest expenses and costs of funds. And for lending institutions, bad debts expenses. When we talk about sources of funds, your liabilities and equities, they have varying degrees of costs. And for us to generate or run the business, we need to have sources of funds, which are then deployed to assets. Those assets could be loans, could be investments, or some other type of income earning property or resource. Now, the cost of debt, cost, C-O-S-T, not cost, C-A-U-S-E, debt, D-E-B-T, no, that the other debt. The cost of debt is actually the price that the enterprise would have to pay in exchange for availing of that funding. And as mentioned earlier, the difference between liabilities and equity is that liabilities has a due date. And that due date includes the repayment of the principal and the cost of that principal in the form of interest. Now, equities in the form of member contributions and other shareholder capital contributions, while they appear not to have any costs to the company or to the cooperative, when for finance perspective, they still have a cost. The cost there is the expectation of generating surplus returns, at times in excess of what is targeted for a particular period. That is a cost to the company. Because, for example, if you raise funding through deposits and you pay back those deposits along with the promised interest, after the withdrawal and termination of time deposits, technically, the cooperative doesn't have any further obligation. Of course, you would want them to come back and to patronize the services of the financial cooperative. However, for finance purposes, once I follow through with my obligation to you for liability in terms of liabilities, after paying the cost of debt, I'm okay. However, for member contributions, as long as the member is there, the expectation of the member is that you will always cater to my needs and my requirements as a member. And that includes generating sufficient amount of returns and surplus every year. So it does not have a deadline compared to deposits, savings, and liabilities. And that one is cost of equity. Now, for liabilities, the cost of debt is usually the interest expense or the interest rate. How do you quantify cost of equity? For this webinar, we will not go deep into that topic because it's a bit technical. But suffice it to say that the proxy for cost of equity is either the dividend yield if the cooperative includes or has a policy of distributing excess surplus that it doesn't have to set aside as dividends. That percentage yield over the original contribution becomes the cost of equity. Another proxy for cost of equity would be the market, available market yield. If, let's say, I invest in a government security or a corporate bond, and that bond earns at least 7%, or if I invest in the stock market and the stock market generates return of, let's say, 15%, that 15% is actually a proxy for the cost of equity. If I were to invest in the stock market rather than provide additional member contributions, I would have earned that 15%. So my expectation as an equity contributor is that this enterprise would at least generate me similar amount, 15%. So between cost of debt and cost of equity, you would know that cost of equity is actually a lot more expensive. It would be cheaper for the enterprise to generate funds through borrowings compared to getting more member contributions, at least from a finance perspective. The business and cooperatives objectives may have a different point of view, and that's understandable. At least for financing perspective, the more you can get cheaper debt funding, the better. However, as highlighted earlier, there is a limit to that. Leverage also introduces a lot more risk to the business, and we need to temper that to a certain extent. Again, ALM plays a significant role in that regard. And overall, the objective for us is to generate asset returns that are more than the weighted average cost of capital. So the goal here, the objective here is for us as a business, from a finance point of view, for our deployment of those assets to generate returns, income, revenue, less expenses, and whatever percentage is that from our assets would be more than the cost of raising funds. If the liabilities were paid 5%, then their cost of debt is 5%. If equity is 15%, but if they're 50-50, 50% liability and 50% equity, then your weighted average cost of capital, which is a combination of your liabilities and equity, would be around 10%. That way, the goal of the business is to generate surplus more than 10%. Okay, may phone in question here. What is your point of view? GRF and other reserves are part of equity, which means without cost or interest expense. But we are mandated to separate the fund, not to use it in the operation for security purposes. Okay, that's a great question. Thank you very much for this one. Now, hey, looking back, no, one main attribute of a cooperative, because we have to follow the cooperative law and other regulations issued by the Cooperative Development Authority, the surplus that we generate for a particular year. So there is a graduated table for that, 50% or 10% or 5%, 3%, depending on purposes. We need to set that aside as part of mandated surplus. Now, it's good that you point out, the person who asked the question, that you need to separate those funds and not commingle it as part of operations. That in and of itself is a cost to the company. Why? Because it reduces the amount of accumulated earnings that can be reinvested into the company. Yes, you're correct. It does not incur the cooperatives any additional interest expense. But you also have to consider it does not also earn the cooperative any additional revenue if you set that aside separate from operations. It's like declaring dividends, meaning you release the cash out of the coffers of the cooperative, but you don't return the money directly to the members. Instead, you keep it in another fund, and that fund will be held in trust for its purpose. If the company or the cooperative is a credit cooperative, that limits the amount of additional funds it could relend in the future. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying that it provides a cap in terms of the ability of that credit cooperative to build their loan portfolio. In terms of cost, while it does not appear to have an accounting cost because you don't pay interest expense, for finance purposes, in terms of your potential to generate as much revenue as possible, excuse me, having that mandate adds a constraint to the cooperative's potential for generating as much revenue. It's also important to note that because you have to segregate that for security purposes, it has its purpose. That's the reason why we don't commingle, is because we don't want you to spend so much money as to eat up on the surplus funds that you're supposed to be setting aside as reserves. But that also adds or limits the potential for that cooperative to pursue their business objectives as fast as they could have. That's why more and more, especially for bank cooperatives, the deposits help them to augment and accelerate the achievement of their business. So yun, I hope I was able to add some context and answer that question. So on paper, it doesn't incur you any expense, but in terms of economics and opportunity costs, it adds a constraint as to your speed of achieving the objective. You can still achieve your profit objectives. Will take you a lot more time and creativity to get the resources. Kasi nga, surplus funds, no, accumulated earnings is an additional funding source. It's a critical component of compounding. But because of the requirement of segregation, ring fencing for security purposes, not commingling with operations, that adds a constraint to your sources of funds. So a business, when you look at a business, from a finance point of view, it's always cheaper to generate funding through borrowing. It's always cheaper from the point of view of the cooperative to borrow and receive deposits versus raise more funds from members. Again, because deposits and liabilities, they are time-bound. So you're only generating additional revenue for a select period of time. Whereas if you get member contributions, as a general rule, if you raise equity, there is no obligation to return it back immediately. But because of that perpetual nature, it has a higher cost in the eyes of the company. Now, if your funding mix is 50% liability, 50% equity, that's fine. However, for financial cooperatives such as banking cooperatives, the proportion of deposits which constitute liability becomes larger, and therefore the financial risk attributable to that the use of liabilities becomes greater. Okay. Another way to look at the balance sheet of a business or cooperative is to stack them into sources and the nature of that source and maturity of those sources as well as the uses of funds. Now, ideally, the member contributions of a cooperative are used to set up the business, to upkeep operations of the business, pay for salaries, premises of the branches of the cooperative banks, as well as all other properties and real estate. Then any surplus that you generate that can be redeployed are not restricted. You can reinvest it in the business. Now, deposits, if the cooperative accepts deposits and they have long-term deposits, long-term meaning more than a year, probably up to 5 years, ideally, those deposits would fund long-term loans. Now, ideally, I will highlight later why I'm emphasizing the word ideally. Same is true with deposits that are less than a year, but more than 6 months. And deposits that are more than 1 month. And deposits that are on demand, funding less than 1 month type of loans. So what I'm highlighting here is that ideally, your sources of funds, their profile, their maturity profile would match that of the maturity profile of your assets. And then you set aside enough cash reserves to support your day-to-day operations. If there is a gap in terms of your target cash reserves and actual cash reserves, you tap into interbank and bank borrowings ranging from overnight or up to less than a month, depending on your liquidity gap. So as a business, ideally you would want to have as much as possible 1:1 because that makes your life a lot easier. In practice, that rarely happens, as we will highlight later on. Obviously, your lending units and your savings units, I would assume they are different units. No? The ones that are looking for loans are not the same ones taking in deposits. I could be wrong because some cooperatives may have a different business model or operating model rather. However, even if it's the same unit that does that, I would assume you wouldn't be able to perfectly match if you receive a one year deposit or 1 year borrowing. You will not accept a 6-month loan. You will only accept 1 month loan. I don't think any business would survive in this environment. So that's why for ALM purposes, the focus is on the interaction between your deposits and your loans. Because technically speaking, your loans are funded by deposits. If you're a credit cooperative, your loans are funded principally by your member contributions. Of course, if it's only one direction, inflows only from your member contributors, there's not much outflows that you have to worry about, then I think it's a lot simpler. But for a cooperative bank, where the outflows of deposits are frequent in terms of volume and activity, then ALM becomes a lot more critical. Now, as mentioned earlier, ALM stands in the middle between lending units and savings units. And one dilemma that ALM has to deal with time and time again is that savings units, because they have deposit targets. So for this quarter, we need to raise, let's say, 10 million worth of additional new to entity deposits or new to bank deposits. The savings unit will say it's difficult to attract new depositors if we don't offer high enough interest rates. We've heard it before. Why am I going to place my deposits with you if I don't earn as much as the other banks are offering? Lately, because of the emergence of digital banks, with the prominence of GCash and Maya and other e-wallets, there are more and more avenues for potential depositors to earn interest on their money. So naturally, your savings unit, in the pursuit for higher deposits that will be brought in to the cooperative, they would want to offer higher interest rates. It's a lot easier for them. It's already difficult to look for new depositors. It's an additional challenge to convince those new depositors to bring in their deposits from a previous bank to your cooperative. On the other side, the lending units, tasked with looking for credit-worthy individuals and businesses to lend to, typically would have a concern of saying, it's very difficult to look for new borrowers because our interest rates are very high. So how are we going to convince more and more new borrowers to borrow from us? Because the goal, again, as a banking cooperative or credit cooperative, the goal is to relent the deposits or funds to generate returns. The concern here is if our interest rates are too high, not a lot of borrowers would want to borrow with us. Now, there's a dilemma. On the right hand side, your sources of funds, they want to increase the cost of funding. On the left hand side, the lending units want to bring down the interest income that the cooperative could earn. How does ALM manage the situation? Let's look at an illustration. Suppose that one morning, the savings unit was able to bring in new deposits, time deposit of 1 year of 1 million pesos at 3%. Example, you were able to convince one new depositor to bring in fresh funds into the cooperative for 1 million pesos. Now, on the same day, just a few hours later, the lending units found a borrower, a credit-worthy borrower that the bank cooperative would want to lend to. Now, credit spread of 2%, that's the margin, no, in tubo, the margin that will be added to the lending, to the funding cost. And that 2% margin becomes the profit or compensation of the credit cooperative or banking cooperative for the lending activity. Now, ignoring all other transaction costs and taxes, how much do you think should the bank lend out? Is it the entire 1 million pesos? Is it 990,000 pesos? Is it 940,000 pesos? Or is it 905,000 pesos? Now, the differences between those choices is principally the reserve requirement. Now, if a cooperative bank is subject to, I think, 1%, then letter B. A thrift bank or digital bank is, I think, 6%, letter C. Commercial banks, I think, at 9.5%. So the answer is letter D. The point here is that for both regulatory and economic purposes or business purposes, the amount of money received in terms of deposit, while you want to lend out as much as possible, again, you need to set aside a portion for contingency in terms of deposit withdrawals or liquidity or other requirements. So you don't lend out the entirety. That's an additional constraint for the financial cooperative. Your funding cost is on 100% of the funds you received, but your potential to earn is only a percentage of that funding base. So that's one constraint that ALM has to deal with. So now, ALM has to figure out a way to convince the lending unit, you need to charge this customer a high enough interest rate such that we will recover the cost of funding. We will be able to earn your credit spread, which is your margin for lending. We would also generate enough returns because we cannot lend everything. If, let's say, you can only lend 99%, the 1% will be set aside and will not earn as much as the loan. So you have to compensate for that as well. Now, speaking of rate, at what rate should the bank lend? Is it not more than 2%? Not more than 3%? Not more than 5%? Or definitely above 5%? Now, obviously, the answer is letter D. You have to earn more than the cost of funds, 3%, and your credit spread of 2%. The goal here is to compensate the financial institution, the banking cooperative, for facilitating the transactions between the two clients. Actually, you don't, are just showing you two sides of the same, two sides being handled by the cooperative. In reality, they don't happen simultaneously. But in this illustration, the goal here is to show na there's more to the cost of intermediation apart from funding, cost of funds. So 3% you have to pay to the depositor. The 2% is compensation for credit risk. But then you have all other financial risks that you have to compensate as well. In this particular example, 1:1, 1 year here, 1 year there. What if the borrower wants to borrow for 2 years instead of 1 year? That adds additional complexity to the transaction. Again, if I'm the savings unit, you ask me to search for a depositor. I got the depositor for you for 3%. All you have to do now is deploy that fund on the other side. If the lending side says, I only found a borrower who would borrow for 2 years and not 1 year, the savings unit cannot say, oh, I cannot force my depositor to make it 2 years. That difference is now managed by ALM in between. Now, as mentioned earlier, the savings unit would, as much as possible, want to bring up the interest to be paid to the depositor. The lending unit will always want to bring down the interest income that will be charged to the customer. What is the mechanism that would make sure that the lending units will not lend at a rate very low or too low, and the borrowing unit will not borrow at a rate too high? That mechanism is called fund transfer pricing. Si BSP interest rate corridor is a monetary policy tool that is applicable market-wide. No, it's not specific to the bank. It's being used by the central bank to influence the market interest rate in the pursuit of achieving economic objectives and monetary policy goals. Usury law is a law that prevents for unjust and unreasonable lending terms and conditions. Conscience is self-explanatory, but it's the fund transfer pricing mechanism that ALM uses to influence lending and savings unit in terms of their interest and pricing objectives. How does a fund transfer pricing mechanism work? So again, your lending units, their goal is to bring as much loans that are qualified as much as possible. The savings unit would bring as much deposits as they can reasonably generate. So ideally, again, as I don't know, I keep on repeating myself, you would want matching amounts and matching due dates. But in reality, in practice, that rarely happens. And that the profile of deposits that are brought in are usually on the short-term side. Because you offer current or savings account, time deposits that are preterminable. And rarely would you, even for large banks, rarely would deposits be kept with them longer than 1 year. So majority of their deposits are short term. Oh, sorry. Loans, on the other hand, no, usually the convention here is that the longer the tenor of the loans, the higher the interest rate. And some of the borrowers, especially those in business, it takes time for them to reap the benefits of their financing. And so they need a longer period of time to recover and generate those cash inflows to pay back for the loan. So the tenor of business loans and some consumer loans also, a car loan, home loan, would usually be long-term in nature. So combining the two together, this will be the profile, the image that you would see on a bank-wide perspective or entity-wide perspective. And ALM is the one who manage that differences so that lending and savings can focus on the respective business objectives. And ALM manages that through netting. So they decide on a particular set of definitions of tenors, and they capture at which part of the tenor or period are they net liability, which part are they net asset. And they compensate the lending and savings units by paying them an internal price or internal rate. That's a fund transfer pricing mechanism. The savings unit will bring in funds. ALM will take those funds, assign a price for those funds, lend those funds to the lending unit, which in turn lends it to the customer outside. And then the lending unit has to pay ALM an internal rate or internal price. So in our example earlier, the savings unit technically will lend the deposit to ALM for the same tenor, 1 year, same amount, 1 million. And then ALM will pay, technically, internally, pay the savings unit a fund transfer pricing rate. In our example, it's around 4.5%. On the other side, ALM, the lending units will borrow from ALM the amount that it will relend or it will lend out, let's say 990,000. This time at the 2-year loan fund transfer pricing rate or FTP rate, 6.5%. In this image, it appears that ALM acts like a bank within a bank. That's basically their role. Again, as mentioned earlier, a bank is a platform between users of funds and savers of funds. ALM is a platform between the savings unit and the lending unit. Now, where did the 4.5% and 6.5% come from? FTP, or fund transfer pricing, is an internal mechanism that's agreed upon between the savings and lending units in coordination with the governance and other relevant institutions, including the risk unit. Now, an FTP rate could be a single price. Let's say all deposits have to pay 4% or have to receive 4%. All loans have to pay 4% regardless of tenor. That's one example. That's quite simple. No? Internally, the cost of funds is 4%. So the deposit unit, the goal is to bring in deposits lower than 4%. The goal of the lending units is to find borrowers who are willing to pay interest more than 4%. However, the problem there is that it does not take into account the maturity dates, the tenor or duration, whether it's short-term or long-term. Using just one rate across the entire cooperative would distort the maturity profile of the company. Some institutions employ dual curves, dual sources of or basis of fund transfer pricing. They have a loan fund transfer pricing and a deposit fund transfer pricing, with different interest rates and tenors. That one is a lot more ideal. Because that way you can price the deposits and loans depending on their tenor buckets, their maturity dates. In our example, we pegged the deposit at 3% for 1 year, while the loan was granted at 8.5% because 6.5% plus 2% equals 8.5%. Internally, the lending unit has to pay the FTP rate. So it lent out at 8.5%, but the cost of funding that loan is 6.5%. The savings unit incurred the cooperative a deposit of 3%, but for their effort, they'll be compensated with a 4.5% internal rate. What's the basis of the FTP? Most often than not, the basis is the prevailing market yield curve, which is generated from the BSP interest rate corridor and policy rates, and combined with the government securities interest rate curve found in the Bloomberg valuation terminals, or BVAL. Now, it's a bit technical at this point, but suffice it to say that the basis for pricing loans and deposits ultimately would be whatever is the prevailing market rates. Why is that? Why is the cooperative bank pegging their interest rate to whatever the market is willing to lend or borrow at that time? The quickest explanation is opportunity costs and revenue, opportunity revenue. I'll elaborate later. Now, as you can see, the market yield curve has some separation between the loan FTP and the deposit FTP. The difference there is additional compensation for liquidity premium. Premium meaning, in addition to compensating the cooperative for potential revenue it could have earned or potential expense it could have incurred had it tapped into the market, because there are varying maturities within the same cooperative, within the same portfolio, there are additional premium that needs to be levied to compensate for managing those differences. Okay. Why are we pegging the internal rates against the market yield? So if you're given the decision-making opportunity, you're given the members of your cooperative, the funds of your cooperative members, a pool of funds, where would you invest them? In government securities guaranteed by the government, or the loans? If your priority is to preserve the capital, you lend to the government because you're pretty much assured it will come back. However, the government securities, their yield, your opportunity to earn is limited, because it's not only you who is after the same assets. A lot of other institutions, larger institutions, are likewise interested to buy the same securities. And as you know, if demand is very high, limited supply, the scarcity tends to push prices upward. And the yield on government securities, they have an inverse relationship with their prices. The yields go down. Now, if the yields are going down, yet you still want to earn enough revenues, you can opt to lend money through the lending units instead of investing in government securities. The question there is how much, at what rate are you willing to agree to lend to someone else in exchange and forgo investing in government securities. This is where opportunity costs come in. You peg your internal rate for pricing purposes at the government securities rate or market rate because you don't want to earn any amount lower than that if you're lending money. So if the market is at 5%, and if someone who is a higher credit risk compared to the government is borrowing at 4%, naturally, you would go with the 5% with the government. Why would I agree to a lower yield at a higher risk? If the government is borrowing at 5%, but this loan applicant is agreeing to borrow funds at 8%, that 3% difference entices you to agree, okay, I'm willing to put in a lot more risk to this money in exchange for higher potential compensation. Again, high risk, high return. For purposes of fund transfer pricing, we peg the loan FTP rate at the market yield because as much as possible, we want to earn whatever the market is earning for that particular investment, plus additional compensation for risk. It goes the same way for deposits. If I am being given funds for deposits and those deposits incur interest expense for the cooperative, but I can go to the market and borrow at a certain rate. For fund transfer pricing purposes, my goal is to borrow as cheaply as possible. If I can borrow from the market at 5%, and this depositor is asking for 6%, I'd rather borrow from the market. But if this depositor is willing to give his or her deposit for only 3% or 2%, that's cheaper compared to the market of 5%. Again, the market yield curve serves as a benchmark for us to be able to gauge, is it worth pursuing this loan or is it worth taking on these deposits? Hence, we use that as a benchmark for as a starting point and benchmark for fund transfer pricing purposes. That way, when you price a deposit or when you price a loan, you encourage the deposit unit, look for a deposit lower than your FTP. You encourage the lending unit, look for a borrower that will borrow at a rate higher than your FTP. That prevents both parties for pricing the respective products too high or too low. Okay. In our example, looking at it from this perspective, the net interest income that will be earned by the cooperative. So it's the difference between the cost of funds of 3% and the asset return of 8.5%. The complication here is that the deposit is for 1 year, the loan is for 2 years. So how do we split the interest income, the net interest income between the units? Kasi FTP is a profit sharing mechanism as well. When you look at the deposit taking unit, the FTP is at 4.5%. Meaning, the deposit or the savings unit, internally, I get 4.5% versus the 3% of the deposit. So I earn 1.5%. The asset generating unit or the lending unit, because I was able to convince the borrower to borrow at 8.5% and my FTP is 6.5%, then I earn the difference. That's my profit. Now, 8.5% minus 3%, that's 5.5%. We have already attributed 3.5% the lending and savings unit. The balance of 2% is for asset liability management. Now, why is ALM being given a portion of the profits where the lending units and the savings units were the ones who worked hard to convince the customers to transact with a cooperative? The reason here is that ALM takes on the risks that are inherent in the lending and savings business. Sure, the lending and savings units manage the relationship, but it's the ALM unit that takes on the financial risk management. Remember, there is a mismatch. The loan is at 2 years, the deposit is at 1 year. The cooperative will not decline either the borrower or the depositor simply because they did not match. Instead, it is up to ALM to manage that difference. And ALM gets compensated for that work by earning a portion of the net interest income of 2%. The challenge here is that si ALM, so si lending unit got a borrower. Let's say that's his quota for the day. It's done for the day. Si deposit taking unit, si savings unit got a depositor. Let's just say that's a quota. He's done for the day. ALM, the work of ALM never stops. That's why the 2% can actually dissipate depending on the market movements, because the market doesn't sleep, doesn't stop. If market rates go up, then they have to calibrate future funding costs and future lending rates. If markets go down, they likewise have to adjust. Similarly, if new deposits and new loans come in at different maturity dates, ALM is the one who must match those differences. In short, ALM's work is pretty stressful because they have to worry about the fund inflows and outflows from time to time. That is the challenge. Hence, the 2% compensation is actually not true compensation in the form that their efforts are continuous for this transaction. No, I'm not saying the lending and savings units have a better life than ALM. No. It's just that for purposes of profit attribution, ALM will surely get a portion of it, but that portion is actually buffer for risks in the future. Whereas the 2% of the lending unit and the 1.5% of the savings unit is already considered hard income for performance attribution purposes, because they were able to generate savings, deposits, and loans at commercial rates above or below the FTP threshold. So ALM pays the savings unit FTP rates so that the savings unit will generate deposits at acceptable rates. Similarly, lending units are charged with FTP costs so that they could peg those costs plus a margin to their customers. If the goal is to generate more deposits, ALM could bring down the FTP rate, encouraging the savings unit. If they want to generate a lot more deposits, ALM could increase the FTP rate paid to the savings unit, encouraging the savings unit to bring in more deposits at higher rates. If you want to discourage loans, charge FTP at a higher rate, and the lending units will have it will have a lot more difficult time looking for qualified borrowers at higher interest rates. And it works the opposite as well. You want to discourage deposit, reduce your FTP rate. You want to encourage loans, reduce your FTP costs. Again, it's a balancing act. And in exchange for accepting interest rates, or for accepting FTP rates, the interest rate risk of those deposits and loans are transferred and centralized within ALM. What is this interest rate risk? We will elaborate on that one after lunch. But suffice it to say that interest rate risk is the risk that changes to market interest rates because of economic environment, demand and supply of funds, and all other causes would have adverse implication to the business. Example, if you lend out at 8.5%, but then the market adjusted such that it is now justifiable, or the market is willing to borrow at 10%, that difference is interest rate risk. Or if a depositor agreed to a 1-year deposit, time deposit of 3%, after taking it on, interest rates went down such that prevailing 1-year time deposit rate is now at 2%. That 1% is interest rate risk from the perspective of the financial cooperative. Again, you don't expect the savings and lending units to focus on that because their objective is to search for qualified depositors and borrowers, completing their documentary requirements, negotiating and convincing the customers to transact with the cooperatives. If those very same savings and lending units are charged with having to worry about market movements for which they are not trained to manage, they don't have access to the financial market tools and channels, then that would add additional unnecessary pressure for the respective business units. So FTP was designed not just to influence the behavior of savings and lending units when it comes to pricing their deposit and loan products, but it is also designed to alleviate the pressure coming from changes in interest rates from those business units. So that when you take those burdens away from the business units, the lending and savings units can focus on looking for new borrowers, for new depositors, generate sales and revenue for the financial cooperative. So ALM is there to share the burden of managing a financial cooperative. If you're a credit cooperative and your lending units are charged with looking for new borrowers or managing relationships with existing borrowers, you want them to focus on that work, to excel at that work. But for them to be asked to also worry about market interest rates and how to manage it from the perspective of the cooperative, that's already inefficient and ineffective. That's why ALM is there to take on that role, centralize those risks, implement a fund transfer pricing mechanism that's fair, reasonable, and effective. FTP would influence the deposit taking units, and the asset generating units in terms of the nature, commercial rates, and types of products that they would respectively market to their clients. Any question po when it comes to FTP? FTP is a critical tool used by banks to price their deposits and loans. Now, in my experience, in other institutions, an example ko niyan is si SM. No? SM, obviously, is not a bank. They have a bank, BDO. But SM, as a corporate and a business, they also institute a form of fund transfer pricing, but it's a lot simpler. They call it cost of funds or cost of money. Such that if they have receivables that are already beyond a certain age, they charge cost of money to that business unit. Because they have to now, SM as a business would now have to find alternative sources of cash that should have been filled by collecting that receivable. So let's say there's a 1 million long outstanding receivable from an SM branch. SM, the central unit, will charge that branch, let's say 10%, like a penalty for non-collection of that receivable. No, internally, they will reduce their performance basis by 10% interest on the 1 million. That cost of fund may or may not have been incurred by SM, but the point there is that cost of fund represents the potential costs being incurred by the company because they are unable to redeploy the cash because they could not collect. And they're penalizing the branch for the non-collection of the receivable. That mechanism functions similarly with FTP for credit and banking cooperatives. FTP is used by ALM to communicate this is the market rate and you can price your loans and deposits based on FTP. Another illustration or example I could cite, if you've been to a branch, a bank branch, or even in a money changer, you would see two exchange rates for the US dollar. One for buying and one for selling. Now, they will buy your dollar at, let's say, 53 pesos, but they will sell you US dollars for 57 pesos. Now, the reason why there are two rates, firstly, because they have to charge commission or margin to make a profit. So they will buy low, sell high. Buy your dollar at 53 pesos to a dollar. Or if you need dollars, you will sell you dollars at 57. 57 minus 53, 4 pesos. That is the margin of that money changer. Similarly, the cost to them for getting the dollars could be more than the spot rate. Let's say the spot rate is 55. They are charging you 57 pesos because they can only find additional dollars for 56. Similarly, they're agreeing to buy your dollars for 53 pesos because they can only resell that dollar at 54. So that 56 and 54 are internal transfer pricing mechanisms that influences the exchange rate that they could offer to the market. So next time that you see a money changer or in a bank, yung board rates, you would have an idea as to where the market is by looking at the midpoint. So if the exchange rate right now is at 55, you would expect banks to charge buying dollars at, let's say, 54.50 and selling US dollars at 56.50 for a margin of 3 pesos or 1.5 cents either side. FTP functions similarly. That it's an internal pricing mechanism that pegs or influences how lending and deposit units price their respective products. The reason also why we started this section of the webinar with the discussion on weighted average cost of capital. Remember, unlike cost of debt, which is interest expense, cost of equity, there's no actual interest expense. No, there's no actual cost to be booked for accounting purposes. But from a finance perspective, there is a cost in accepting more equity than liability. FTP incorporates and implements that concept that since I am accepting more and more deposits, the pricing must also incorporate my cost of debt, my incremental cost of debt. Since the subject is asset liability management, so walang equity, meaning we don't use equity for funding purposes. That means our pricing, likewise, only focus on the principal source of funding, which is liability. Now, how would a credit cooperative apply funds transfer pricing? It will have to tweak the funding source perspective because remember, a credit cooperative principally will rely on member contributions as source of funds to be lent out. That cost of funds, when you need to increase your funding base, you need to encourage more members to contribute to the cooperative, unless you want to leverage on borrowing. Still, if your sources of funds is equity, and your incremental source of funds would also be equity, your internal pricing mechanism would have to reflect that. And since cost of equity is higher than cost of debt, your FTP will have a higher rate compared to a cooperative that uses savings and deposits for funding purposes. It makes sense because cost of liabilities is always lower than cost of equity. And your FTP mechanism will reflect that reality. That's why there are many financing and lending institutions in the country. But they will not be able to grow as large, as fast as possible if unless they become a bank. So banks can take on a lot more deposits, lend it at market, and if they are able to keep their defaults very low, manage their funds differences prudently, then they would be able to generate returns far higher than a typical lending or financing company. Because again, the cost of equity is prohibitive enough that it becomes a constraint to the ability of the cooperative to grow organically. Okay, time now is 11:45. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please use the chat box, leave it there, either anonymously, or if you want others to see the questions beforehand, that's fine. I will take that up during breaks and discussions. It's 11:45 and I am suggesting that we take our lunch break now so that you can have enough time to prepare and also go ahead of the line sa cafeteria. I would request that we come back promptly at 1 p.m. so that we can start and finish on time. Miss Maris?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Jobs. Again, I'll be flashing on the screen the timer for our 1 hour and 15-minute break. We'll see you after we'll start at 1 p.m. Thank you. Let's enjoy the break.
Thank you.